Okay, hey, we're going to cover the Cold War. This is going to be a long one. I'm going to try to do this all in one video. Um, give you the option, I guess, of chopping it up by yourself if you need to. But when we're looking at the Cold War, we're looking at this period after World War II, in which the United States and the Soviet Union are the two world superpowers, right? And the Cold War is this name it's given to the struggle for hegemony between the United States and the Soviet Union. And when we come up with this word hegemony, basically what we're referring to is power, this predominance or influence over different areas. And the Cold War is interesting because the United States is going to exhibit a lot of power over places like Western Europe, while the Soviet Union is going to exhibit a lot of power over Eastern Europe. And then the rest of the world is where you're going to see this conflict between these two ideas of government play out. Okay. Like we said before, the Soviet Union and the United States are the two main world powers after the end of World War II. And this period from, I don't know, 1946 until 1992, or I guess 1992, is is called the Cold War because there's no direct military conflict between the United States. There's a bunch of proxy wars in which the two nations fund other nations to fight each other. There's, a ton of spying. There's almost a number of wars, but we get through this whole period without fighting the war. And when we look at the difference between socialism and capitalism, I like this cartoon here because it kind of I don't know if it's actually accurate, but what we're dealing with is who has the power, the gun, who has the power, and who has the money. And so that's your difference between socialism and capitalism. All right. Ultimately, how powerful is the government, and who has the money? Is it the people or is it the government? And if you look at some of these ideas, I don't know if I can answer that one way or the other. But we look at the United States. The United States is a capitalist nation, right? And so what does that mean? Well, it means you have private ownership of business. You have a free market in which trade can take place. You have it's a democratic government or a democracy in which you have free elections. You have multiple political parties, and basically people decide who should rule and what they should buy. And so when I think about capitalism, the example I like to use is pickup trucks. Think about all the different types of pickup trucks you can buy in the United States. You can buy a Ford, a Dodge, a Chevy. You can buy a Nissan. You can buy a Cadillac truck. You can buy a Toyota. You can buy a Honda. You can buy I don't know if I said GMC, but you can buy a GMC. So right off the top, but just really briefly, there's 8 different types of trucks that you can buy, and those are just the brands. Then you can get, a king cab with 2 doors. You can get an extended cab with 3 doors. You can get an extended cab with 2 doors. You can get a quad cab with 4 doors. You can get a 2-wheel drive. You can get a 4-wheel drive. You can get a dually that has, 2 extra wheels on the back. You can get you can get a 6-cylinder, you can get a 4-cylinder, you can get a V8, you can get a V10. I want to say that Dodge made a V12. You can get a gasoline engine truck, you can get a diesel engine truck, you can get you can get a short bed, you can get the long bed, you can get an extended bed. Really your options are pretty well limitless. And that's capitalism. The market decides what you pay, and the consumer decides what they want, and the market decides what you're going to pay for it. In the Soviet Union, you have a totalitarian government, which means you have political elections that only have one party, and you have a communist economy in which the government controls the production and the markets, and so you're very limited on your choices. Oh. And I used the example of Yugo, and this car was actually made in Yugoslavia and came to the United States for a short period of time. But when you look at the cars made in the Soviet Union during this period of communism, your options were very limited. It was a yellow 4-door, a yellow 2-door, a black 2-door. They almost always had the same options, right? And that's because the government sets the price of something, and business tries to create a product to meet that price point where they can still profit. And so businesses don't have an incentive to innovate for new products like they do in capitalism. Okay. So we look at those differences again. In the United States, you have democratic government, capitalism, free elections, private industry, free market society. The Soviet Union, you have a communist government, you have communist economy, one-party government, government-controlled industry, and government-controlled markets. And how do we get there? Well, in 1945, July of 1945, after the fall of Nazi Germany, the big three get together, right? And the prime minister from Great Britain, the president of the United States, and the leader of the Soviet Union get together. The problem is, like, Stalin had promised free elections in Poland and East Germany, but he changes his position because by the time we get to Potsdam, well, Roosevelt's no longer among the living, and so he's been replaced by Truman. And Churchill actually gets voted out of office during the meeting, and so this is the new Prime Minister of England. And so Stalin, he'd made promises to Roosevelt and Churchill during the war, but Roosevelt and Churchill aren't around anymore. So why does he need to maintain those promises, right? Ultimately, the Soviets want to punish Germany for the war, and they want to make sure that Germany doesn't attack them again. All right. And so ultimately, it's decided that each side, the Allies and the Germans, or the Allies and the Russians, are going to divide up Germany, right? And we're going to divide it into 4 sections. Ultimately, the United States wants to create a new world order, and England is part of this too, in which nations have self-determination. They want access to raw materials and the markets in Western Europe. They want to rebuild European economies, and they want a unified and strong Germany. Soviet Union wants to encourage the growth of communist nations. The idea of communism, again, is to spread, or I guess the idea of communism is to spread this idea of the ideas of communism into a worldwide communist state. They want to rebuild the Russian economy using European industry, and they want to control Eastern Europe as a balance and buffer between the Soviets and the West. And following the war, the Soviets are relatively strong economically and militarily, but they just fought a huge war. And Stalin ultimately sees the United States and communism as being incompatible, and believes that the war with the West is probably an inevitable, and he wants to buy himself as much time as he possibly can. And so the Soviet Union is going to set up satellite nations in places like Albania and Bulgaria, and they're going to create this eastern bloc of nations that's going to be this buffer zone against the West. And so, if the West is here in Germany or France or whatever, and they're going to attack the Soviet Union, they're going to have to go through all these countries first, and it's going to keep the Soviet land safe for a longer period of time, I suppose, right? Roosevelt gives this speech in Fulton, Missouri, in which he refers to this division between East and West as an Iron Curtain. And so when you hear the word the Iron Curtain, what he's talking about is this idea of control. And so, like, the Russians control Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Germany and those types of places, and Western Germany and Switzerland and Austria, are the West. And so there's a clear division between communism and capitalism there. Okay. We're trying to figure out how to deal with capitalism and communism. And George Kennan comes up with this idea. He was a United States diplomat, and he writes his ideas down and he transposes it on a telegram line over a Thanksgiving break holiday when there wasn't a whole lot of traffic, and his ideas are put together in something referred to as a long telegram, where basically he comes up with this idea of containment, in which he argues that the Soviets and the Russians, and communism in general, feels inferior to capitalism, and so in order to overcome those fears, they have to oh, I don't know, show force, or show the ability to show force. And so like if the Americans or the capitalists don't necessarily attack the communists on their own soil, um, they're going to be better off, because it's going to deflect that conflict. But what the capitalists can't do, or capitalist nations can't do, is they can't allow communism to spread. So if you contain communism, communism will use up its own resources and then burn itself out. Think of it as a match, or a book of matches that are placed under, a glass cup. It's going to burn real brightly for a short period of time, but then it's going to use up all of its oxygen. And so that's basically what this idea of containment comes down to, right? Um, Shortly thereafter, in March of 1947, Truman's going to issue a doctrine that says, hey, it's the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting armed subjugation by outside pressures. And so we're going to use the Truman Doctrine as a way to send money into Greece and Turkey. And those are two nations that, if we go back to here, our little map, Greece is down here. Greece is down here and Turkey's on the other side. So it's right there on that edge of that Iron Curtain, and the communists are looking to spread. And so Truman's going to use his ideas to send guns and money to Turkey and Greece in order to try to stop the spread of communism. And ultimately, he's successful in doing that. The other plan that's going to go into place is going to be the Marshall Plan. And so after World War II, Europe is basically this huge mess. Germany's a mess, France is a mess, everything, anywhere that the war was, is just destroyed. Cities are destroyed, people are out of work. And so in 1947, George Marshall basically develops a plan. He's going to provide aid to all nations that need it. He's going to give everybody money that needs it, not against doctrine or political ideas, but against like this idea of hunger and chaos and whatever. And ultimately, we're going to spend about $13 billion rebuilding Europe. And we can see here on this map, these are the nations that are going to get the majority of the money. And those nations that get that money are going to be the non-communist nations. And so it's going to be nations of the Western world. Using the Marshall Plan, basically, we help to revitalize the European economy, which is gonna be beneficial to the United States in multiple ways. Number one, it keeps them from going communist, and so we keep democratic allies. Number two, it provides markets for U.S. goods, and so if people are at work, we're able to sell them the refrigerators and the cars and the radios and the televisions and all the stuff that America is going to produce during this time frame. And so the question again is, how is a Marshall Plan a tool of containment? Well, it shows off that, hey, if you look at the Marshall Plan tractor over here, that's a whole lot better. An American-made tractor is better than pulling under the yoke and the yoke of communism, pull the hammer and sickle there, right? And so we're going to run into this problem for Germany. The United States wants a reunited Germany, or unified Germany, and the Soviet Union want a weak, divided Germany. And so how are we going to get there? Well, after the war, we decided that we're going to divide Germany into 4 parts. And the Soviets are going to get the eastern half, the Americans are going to get a zone, the French are going to get a zone, and the British are going to get a zone. And then ultimately, we're going to do the same thing with Berlin. We're going to divide Berlin into East Berlin and West Berlin. And you're going to have the French sector, the American sector, and the British sector, along with, and that's in Western Berlin. And Eastern Berlin, you're going to have the Soviet sector. And you go back to this map here, it's kind of odd because Berlin sits deep within the Soviet zone. So you're going to have half of the capital city right in the middle of communist central. And so in 1948, the Americans, the British, and the French all combined their sections of Germany to form a new nation called West Germany. And they create a new currency, which is called the Deutschmark. Right. And the Soviet Union is threatened by the formation of Western Germany. And they decide to close all the roads to Western Berlin. And so you have the city, again, you have Berlin that's sitting back here in the Russian zone. And there were train tracks and highways that led to Berlin from the eastern part. And so the Soviets decide they're going to close all the roads to West Berlin in June of 1948. So it's going to prevent fuel and food and supplies from coming into West Berlin. And there's a problem because all of a sudden you have 2 million people that live in West Berlin, and you have troops stationed there, and there's not enough food or supplies to keep people alive. And so your choices are, well, number one, you could just like attack East Germany and take and hopefully just go in there and take over. But that's not an idea of containment, right? That's brute force. And so what the Americans and the British are going to do is we're going to create something known as the Berlin Airlift, in which we're going to fly food and supplies into Berlin. We're going to use the surplus or the old Allied bombers that are sitting around. We're going to load them full of supplies, and we're going to fly them into the former German capital. And so for basically a year, for 327 days, the Allies are going to fly these non-stop flights around the clock. And they're going to land in West Berlin. They're going to take millions of pounds of food, and they're even going to take Christmas presents to West Berlin for the kids. And in May of 1949, the Soviets opened the roads to West Berlin, and everybody's good. And the Berlin Airlift is a huge, major victory for the West. The Marshall Plan is a huge victory for the West, and even the Truman Doctrine is a victory for the West, and the fact that it keeps communism from spreading in Europe. So the airlift saves Western Berlin, it boosts the American image throughout the world, and it shows that containment works. Shortly thereafter, in April of 1949, the Western Europeans, nations that are fearful of Soviet aggression, look to unify in some kind of an alliance. And we formed NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And so Belgium and Berlin and France, Great Britain, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United States, and Canada all joined NATO as a unified front against communist or Soviet aggression. NATO is still around today and has grown from those original members. The basic premise is if one nation in NATO is attacked, the other nations would help it out. This is the first peacetime alliance in the history of the United States, and it also allows about 500,000 troops and military equipment from the Americans to stay in Europe to act as a deterrent to Soviet aggression. And so our ideas of containment in Europe are going to be the Truman Doctrine that's going to protect freedom, the Marshall Plan that's going to rebuild Europe. So the Truman Doctrine is going to give guns and money to people to resist hostile takeovers. The Marshall Plan is going to be used to rebuild European industry for the shipment of American raw goods and for American markets. The Berlin Airlift is a way that we could provide aid humanitarily without using military force. And then finally, NATO is that military force if needed. And I guess that's where we're going to stop. We'll just do Cold War in Europe to begin with, and then we'll come back to Cold War in Asia in the next video. So I'll see you then. Bye-bye.